Narada Muni continued, O best of the Pandavas, your two cousins Shishupal and Dantavakra, the sons of your maternal aunt, were formerly associates of Lord Vishnu, but because they were cursed by Brahmanas, they fell from Vaikuntha to this material world. So before I begin, just ask and seek the blessings of all the Vaishnavas present. We see in this verse, I think it's Narada Muni speaking to Yudhishthira Maharaj. Is that right? Okay. And he's mentioning how Shishupal and Dantavakra, although externally appearing as demons, were actually devotees of the Lord. And this is quite an interesting pastime. And one thing that it teaches us is that things are not always what they seem. If we go back and look at, because it's mentioned that they were formerly residents of Vaikuntha, and they fell from Vaikuntha to the material world. This is explained in the third canto. The two personalities in question are Jay and Vijay. And this pastime is described in the 15th chapter and the 16th chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And previous to this chapter, we hear about Diti, and how Diti is overcome with lust, and she approaches Kashyapa Muni, and she asks him to alleviate her desire. But he warns her, if they engage in this illicit activity, then the outcome will be very inauspicious. And he tells her that you'll give birth to two demons, and those demons will cause disturbances to the great sages, to the demigods. They will torture and kill innocent personalities. But she's overcome by the desire. As a result, Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha take birth in her womb. Now Diti understood that these demons would eventually appear and would cause disturbances. So it's described through her potency, she kept Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha in her womb for 100 years. But even then, these demons were so powerful that they were affecting the universe. It's described that the sun dimmed and the universe was completely covered in darkness. And so the demigods could understand that there was imminent danger. So the demigods approached Brahma in great fear. And Brahma is described, he smiled. And then he began to relate the journey his own sons, the Kumaras, undertook to Vaikuntha to explain what was actually happening. And he's described how the four Kumaras, they traveled to Vaikuntha. And then Lord Brahma begins to describe the beauty of Vaikuntha. And as he's describing Vaikuntha, it's described that he's experiencing great ecstasy. And in his great enthusiasm, he kind of interrupts his description, and he just begins to describe the wonder of human life. He begins to describe how great an opportunity human life is for attaining self-realization. He explains also that even demigods, they desire to take birth as human beings. And Prabhupada mentions in the purport to that section, he says that if one doesn't take advantage of his human birth, he's practically committing suicide. If one doesn't use human life for spiritual pursuits, he's committing suicide. And then Brahma goes on, and then he continues the narration, and it goes back to the description of Vaikuntha. And then he describes how the Kumaras enter Vaikuntha. And entering Vaikuntha, it's described that they experience great happiness, unprecedented happiness. And then it's described how they pass through 6 gates and they come to the 7th gate. And they see in the distance, they see 2 gatekeepers. And it's described that these 2 gatekeepers appear just like Vishnu. They resemble the features of Vishnu. So we can understand that they're Vishnu Dutas. And it's described that they have a fresh garland around their neck, and there's bees swarming around their neck. And it's described that they had a glow. They're described as shining beings. But they noticed a certain change of expression on the gatekeepers' faces when the Kumaras approached. It's described that they seemed agitated that the Kumaras were present. It's described that their eyebrows began to arch, their nostrils flared. And now the Kumaras, they appear in the body of a child. And it's described just as a child innocently enters a place, not aware that, sometimes they're trespassing laws. Similarly, they enter the seventh gate. And as they entered the seventh gate, Jay and Vijay stood in front of them, blocked them with their staff. At this point, the Kumaras became angry. Now, these are great sages. So one may question, how can great sages like the Kumaras become angry? So Prabhupada makes several points in the purport to show that the anger of the Kumaras was not an ordinary anger. He said, one point is that the Kumaras are liberated, so their anger is not ordinary. Another point he makes is that sadhus and sannyasis, they can go anywhere and demand anything. That's a right that they have. A sadhu and a sannyasi can go anywhere and demand anything. And we know that the Kumaras were the best of sadhus and the best of renunciates. I don't encourage anyone and everyone here to do that. Go to Marks and Spencer's and pick up something off the shop shelf and say, sadhus and sannyasis can do anything. But traditionally, Vedic culture meant that society would allow sadhus and sannyasis to do anything. Also, it's described that the Kumaras were innocent, like a child. And so sometimes a child, if it's checked, it naturally becomes angry. It's also described that their anger was not due to their being restricted in their sense gratification. Their anger came because they were restricted in their service to the Lord. So it's described that the Kumaras, they spoke sharply to the two persons. They actually said that, who are these two persons that think that an enemy can enter Vaikuntha? Who could be envious of the Supreme Lord, they state. And they say, therefore these two gatekeepers, or these two personalities that are posing as gatekeepers, they must be imposters. And such that they're thinking everyone else is an imposter. Like you have that verse, Atmavan manyate jagat. Everyone thinks that everyone thinks like them, right? And so similarly, they're thinking that they're accusing others of being imposters because they're imposters themselves. And they make an interesting point. They say that there can be no enemy in Vaikuntha. And in the purport, Prabhupada goes on to describe the nature of Vaikuntha. He's described there are no enemies of the Lord in Vaikuntha. All the residents have good qualities. There's no politics in Vaikuntha. There's no lust. There's no anger. There's no greed. There's complete harmony. And Prabhupada gives the example, just like if you have a machine, different parts work together in harmony to fulfill the particular purpose of that machine. So similarly, the devotees in Vaikuntha also work together to please the Lord. And Prabhupada makes a very interesting point. He said, ISKCON is attempting to replicate the principles of the spiritual world in the material world. It's like, I think the Jehovah's Witnesses say, God's kingdom on earth. Is it Jehovah's Witnesses? So similarly, Prabhupada is trying to establish God's kingdom in the material world. And so we should always remember this when we're living and interacting with devotees in ISKCON, that we're trying to emulate the spiritual world. Now, the Kumaras have cursed, or are about to curse Jay and Vijay. They actually cursed them to leave Vaikuntha and fall into the material world. And hearing this curse, Jay and Vijay become filled with fear. And it's described that they go down and bow down and go to the feet of the Kumaras. But in their humility, they accept the curse, but they ask one request of the Kumaras, that even if they do fall to the material world, that they do not forget the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So we can see by Jay and Vijay committing this offense, there was a severe reaction. And this also teaches us that we should be careful of committing offenses to other Vaishnavas. And the Chaitanya Charitamrita, so one verse describes the effect of Vaishnava Parad. It says, Yadi Vaishnava Aparada Ute Haiti Mata Upaidava Chinda Tare Shuki Yaya Pata. It's described that our devotional life is compared to a creeper. When we chant, when we hear, when we perform devotional service, it's compared to watering that plant. And imagine you have that plant in a garden. And then, for some strange reason, you decide to invite a mad elephant into that garden. When you commit offense, that's what basically you're doing. And this elephant is described uproots the devotional creeper. So you lose all your devotional credit. Well, you don't lose it because Krishna says there's no loss or diminution, but it becomes covered. And Prabhupada says that if one commits Vaishnava aparad, you're murdering your own position in devotional service. He uses that word. He uses murder. It's quite a strong word. So, the Jay and Vijay beg for forgiveness. At that moment, it's described that Lord Narayan, he heard about the curse. And it's described as soon as he heard about that curse, him and Lakshmi Devi came rushing to where the incident was taking place. And he came as quick as he could have, because he knew this whole situation had been created because the Kumaras were thwarted in their desire to see the Lord. And Jiva Goswami makes several interesting points on this verse. He says that, normally when the Lord moves from one place to another, he has his specific way of, he has his own transport system. It means Garuda. But it's described, because he was in such a rush to see the Kumaras, he neglected Garuda. He also wanted to show the Kumaras that he was eager to come before them, so much so that he had run on his own 2 feet. In addition, Jiva Goswami explains that he also brought Lakshmi Devi there. So he wanted to secure their forgiveness by showering them with opulences from Lakshmi Devi. So in this way, it's described that the Lord tried to pacify the Kumaras. And it's described as when the Lord appeared, the Kumaras took darshan of the Lord, and it's described that their eyes were unsatiated. And it's described as the Kumaras were taking darshan of the Lord, a breeze went past, and it's carried the aroma from the tulsi leaves that were situated at the lotus feet of the Lord. We understand that the Kumaras were attached to the impersonal aspect of the Supreme Lord. But it's described by their association with Tulsi Devi, they became personless. And so this is also described in this section. And then the Kumaras, they begin to express their gratitude to the Lord for coming before them. They describe that it's very rare that one gets darshan of the Lord. They describe how many people in this world speculate for thousands and thousands of years and don't actually understand the Supreme Lord. And only when one is favored, even slightly by the Supreme Lord, can one understand Him. And Prabhupada describes the qualifications that the Kumaras had to come before the Lord, or have darshan of the Lord. He said one quality that they had was that they were pure. They had purity. They were completely free from material contamination. In fact, it's described when they were born, Brahma actually requested them to become Prajapatis and assist him in creation. But they refused because they didn't want to get entangled in material life. It's also described how they didn't age, because the idea is that when one is a child, one is somewhat innocent. Material desires haven't entered. So in this way, they exhibited purity. The second quality that they had was that they were very sincere. It's described that this form of the Lord was previously described to them by Brahma. And as a result, they'd gone on a whole search to find the Supreme Lord. And they'd ultimately gone all the way to Vaikuntha to try and find the Lord. And in regard to this is one word, Tatra loyalam ekalam mulyam. It's described that the secret to spiritual success is that one has to be greedy. Right, we hear this concept that we have to be greedy for Krishna if we want to receive the Lord's mercy. Just like, when someone's very hungry, one has appetite, then one can eat lots of food. So we also have to develop this hunger and this greed to see the Lord, to serve the Lord. And in this way, one receives the mercy of the Lord. Once Srila Prabhupada was on a morning walk it may have been here in the UK actually, and there was a lake, a pond on one side, and there were ducks there. And so Prabhupada decided to feed the ducks. And the devotees noticed that Prabhupada was feeding one duck more than the others. And so they asked why. And Prabhupada said that because this duck is greedy, I'm feeding it. This duck would always come to the front and would always be trying to get Prabhupada's attention. So in a similar way, we have to try and develop this greed for Krishna. Then the Kumaras begin to apologize to the Supreme Lord because of their previous engagements. Firstly, they mentioned how they were impersonalists. And they explained that actually even going to hell is better than being an impersonalist. Because when you're an impersonalist, you don't have a relationship with the Lord. But even in hell, you can still have a relationship with the Lord. They also mentioned how they were regretful that they had rashly cursed Jay and Vijay. And so they were fearing that they had committed the offense. And so they were thinking that they may have to enter hell. And so they asked the Lord for the benediction that even if we do have to go to hell, let us still remember you. And you find this a lot with the great souls, the great devotees. They don't actually care where they go, whether they're in heaven, whether they're in hell. Their only fear is that they forget the Supreme Lord. And Prabhupada makes an interesting point in that section. He says that one may be put in any position, but God gives the prerogative to chant Hare Krishna. So in our own spiritual lives, we may be put in difficult situations, we may be put in comfortable situations, but the Lord always gives us the opportunity to chant Hare Krishna. And a real devotee, regardless of where he's put, where he's situated, he will always find ways to remember Krishna. Then the Lord responds to the prayers that the Kumaras offered. And in this section, what you find is the Lord's Bhakta Vatsal feature coming out. He admits his servant had committed a great offense. And he takes it as if he's committed the offense himself. And he personally asks the Kumaras to forgive him and the servants. And Prabhupada makes an interesting point in the purport. He says that a devotee, he should be very careful. He should actually be blameless. Because if he commits an offense, it's a scar on the Supreme Lord. When all the time, as Hare Krishna devotees, we're representing Krishna. And if we give people a bad impression, it's actually reflected on Krishna. Like we find often devotees, they come to our movement and they may have a bad experience with a devotee. It's not that they just leave the association of devotees, but they leave their association with Krishna. So we should understand that we have a great responsibility in that regard. The Lord then goes on again to try and rectify the offense that had been committed. He explains that even if one of my arms is hostile to you, I'm ready to cut off my own arm. So this is the greatness of the Lord. And then he goes on to describe how people consider his lotus feet very sacred, right? We are told to meditate on the lotus feet of the Lord, because by meditating on the lotus feet of the Lord, we become free from sins. He describes how Lakshmi Devi, people perform tapasya and penances to attain the association of Lakshmi Devi. But in Vaikuntha, thousands of Lakshmis are serving the Lord. And he describes that these two qualities, that his lotus feet are sacred, and the fact that thousands of Lakshmi Devis serve him, these two qualities are attained because he associates with his devotees, because he serves his devotees. So he's giving credit, his great qualities, he's giving credit to his devotees. And Prabhupada says, this is the nature of the Lord. That the Lord thinks that I have great qualities because of my devotees. And the devotees, he says, they think they have great qualities because of the Lord. And he says, because of these two reasons, they are both anxious to serve each other. The Lord also describes how when sacrifices and yagyas are being performed, oblations are offered in the sacrificial fire. And through that, the Lord eats. But in addition to that, the Lord also takes offerings through the mouths of the brahmanas. And the Lord says that, I prefer to be served through the mouths of the brahmanas than to be served by offering oblations into the sacrificial fire. And we also understand this principle is important because we hear how the Lord is more pleased when we serve the devotees of the Lord than when we serve the Lord directly. So in this way, the Lord is again and again glorifying the position of devotees. He also mentions, if I can take the dust of the feet of the Vaishnavas on my head, who will refuse to do the same? So the Lord is also ready to take the dust from the devotees. And so the Kumaras, hearing this response, naturally they're a little surprised. They're a little confused. They're thinking, what does the Lord actually want us to do? Is he pleased with us or is he angry with us? Because they suspected that they had committed an offense. But yet at the same time, here we see that Brahmanas, the Vaishnavas are being glorified. The Kumaras are being glorified. And so the Kumaras begin to respond. And they explain, actually, you're just saying all these things so because you're teaching by your example that Brahmanas and Vaishnavas should be respected. But truly speaking, the object of worship for Brahmanas is you. He explains, the Kumaras explain that actually no one is actually in a position to bestow favor upon you. And they describe how Tulsi Devi, the only reason she has good qualities is because she's situated at your lotus feet. And Prabhupada kind of reiterates this point. He says that the conclusion is that no one can be the benefactor of the Lord. Everyone is the servant of the Lord. But what we see in this verse is an expression of the Lord's humility. And we see an expression of the Lord's quality as Bhaktavatsal, how he is conquered by the love of the devotees. We also see how important it is that we must offer proper respects to the Brahmanas and Vaishnavas. And the Kumaras end their response by again apologizing for the rash curse that they had committed. And they explain how actually Jay and Vijay, they were actually innocent, but they had picked the fault. And in respect to this point, Prabhupada makes an interesting point. He says that when dealing with devotees, we should be careful that we don't pick faults. And he quotes one verse from the Gita, Apichet Sudaracharo Bhajate Mamananyabhak. Krishna explains that even if a devotee commits the most abominable activity, one should still consider him a sadhu. Now I should qualify that because otherwise, you may think I'm trying to justify deviations. But Prabhupada explains that sometimes due to our former habits, we may have certain conditionings. And as a result, we may accidentally commit sin. In the next verse to that, Krishna says, Shipram bhavati dharatma shashvak shantim nakachati. He explains that quickly, this person who's committed this accidental sin, he comes to the righteous platform. And a sign that this person is actually should be forgiven is that he's repentful, he's regretful. So we should be cautious and careful when we deal with devotees and make judgments on devotees. So now you have this situation where it's a little unclear who's at fault. On one side you have Jay and Vijay, who prevented the Kumaras from entering the 7th gate. And they felt that they had committed a great sin to these great souls. But then you have the Kumaras who are thinking they're at fault because, they picked fault on, these great servants of the Lord, Jay and Vijay. And then you have the Lord also taking responsibility because he's saying that, they're my servants, so I'll take responsibility. And so then the Lord clarifies the whole position. He explains actually that this whole pastime had been preordained. It was actually the Lord's arrangement, that the Brahmanas were an instrument of the Lord to allow the Lord to facilitate a pastime. As we hear in today's verse, how Shishupal and Dantavakra were previously servants of the Lord. And Prabhupada makes an interesting point in the Prabhupada. He says that the Lord sometimes he desires to fight. And he argues, otherwise how does it exist in us? And just a few days ago, it was Varahadev's appearance day. And we see also the Lord again expressing his feelings or his desires. And it's described how when Hiranyaksha saw Lord Varahadev, he began to verbally abuse the Lord. And he criticized him in so many ways. And he said that those criticisms were like shaft-like words that pained the Lord. And so Prabhupada says in that purport, he said that the Mayavadi philosophers, they have real difficulty understanding that the Lord has feelings. And he mentions in that section, he says that the Lord is as sentient as us. He is pleased when we work in alignment with him, when we speak pleasing words. And he's dissatisfied when we don't do things that please him. So the Lord has feelings. But for the Mayavadis, it's very hard to conceive. They see feelings, they see personality, they see form as a product of Maya. And Prabhupada gives an interesting example in reference to this, why they think this. He speaks about the jackal and who was trying to get some grapes. There's a jackal and he was trying to acquire some grapes, but the tree that the grapes were situated on was too high up. So he was leaping and leaping, attempting and attempting, but he couldn't quite reach them. Shishi Radha Gokulananda ki jai. Shishi Gaur Nitai ki jai. Shishi Sitaram Lakshman Hanuman ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. So Prabhupada was describing how the jackal was trying to acquire grapes, but he couldn't reach the grapes. So then he turned around to all his friends and he said, these grapes are sour anyway. And so this is what the Mayavadis do. They try to enjoy the material world, but they don't. And so they describe that this material world doesn't exist. They say form doesn't exist, feelings doesn't exist, personality doesn't exist. They just cut everything. But we see through the Bhagavatam, this isn't actually the case. That there is a pure form, there is a pure way that we can relate and have relationships. There's a pure way that we can express our feelings. So it's described, after the Lord revealed his true desire, that the sages, they circumambulated the Lord and departed. And then the section, it returns to the original pastime where Brahma is trying to pacify the demigods. And so Brahma concludes, and he says that, in regards to Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha being born, he says that there is no remedy within my power, for it is the Lord himself who desires this. And just as the Lord is creating this whole situation, he will eventually come to our rescue. And then he ends, he says, so what purpose can we serve on his behalf by deliberating on this subject? And then Prabhupada explains in the purport that when something is arranged by the Lord, although externally it may appear as a disturbance or a reverse according to one's calculations, one should continue on in his service. And he gives another example. We see one example here, but he says sometimes a powerful preacher is killed, or sometimes he is put into great difficulty. And he gives various examples. Anyone can think of some of the typical examples Prabhupada presents? He gives about 7. Jesus Christ, yeah? He gives that. Haridas Thakur. He doesn't give that, but he gives the Pandavas. Sorry? Prahlad Maharaj. Ambarish Maharaj. Chitraketu Maharaj, he gives. Rantidev. You want to say? Someone else? He doesn't give Bhaktivedanta Maharaj. But we see that this is the story of all great souls, and we often see that this is narrated again and again in scripture. Sometimes things aren't always as they appear. And Prabhupada mentions in that purport, he says also, one should understand that the Lord has some plan. And if one serves with this mood, he is guaranteed to go back to Godhead. He also quotes a great Mahajan, Bhishmadev. Nahi asya karhichet rajan pumam veda vihitzitam yajvichi gyansaya yukta muyanti kavayopihi. We see that Bhishmadev is addressing Yudhishthira Maharaj, and he says that no one can understand the plan of the Lord. Even great philosophers, great kavis, they try and understand the nature of the Lord, but they cannot understand the Lord. And Sridhar Swami says that when he says no one can understand the plan of the Lord, it's described that Bhishmadev points to Krishna in that reference. And just to kind of give you a little history behind why Bhishmadev is saying this to Yudhishthira Maharaj. Yudhishthira Maharaj is described in the previous chapter to that verse being stated. It's described that he's mortified. That's the word that's used. Because of him, well, this is what he feels. Because of him, this whole Mahabharata had to take place. And it's described that 640 million soldiers had to die. It's described that there were rivers of blood. If you walk through the battlefield, you will see limbs displayed. And, Vyasadeva tries to pacify Yudhishthira Maharaj. Krishna himself tries to pacify Yudhishthira Maharaj. But none of them can pacify him. So Krishna ultimately takes Yudhishthira Maharaj to Bhishmadev. Actually, Krishna and Vyasadeva could have pacified Yudhishthira Maharaj. But Lord Krishna, he wanted to show the world the glories of Bhishmadev. It's described that the Pandavas underwent one suffering after another. And it's described that this, from an external perspective, can seem a little strange, because we also understand that the Pandavas were actually pure devotees of the Lord. And so we can understand that reactions that they got in their life were not due to past misdeeds. So the Acharyas, they explain that sometimes when the Lord has a mission, He uses His devotees to teach that mission or teach that particular lesson. And so the Lord wanted to establish religious principles on this planet. And so it's described that His devotees had to temporarily suffer because of that. And Prabhupada gives a nice example. He says that sometimes the mother-in-law, she'll teach the daughter-in-law through who? The daughter. Why? Because that intimate relationship may not be there between the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law. So she'll teach her indirectly through the daughter. So similarly, Krishna, He sometimes teaches the world through His confidential servants or His confidential devotees. And so in this instance, sometimes it may be, or like in this example, it may be difficult to understand the plan of the Lord. But through the eyes of the great saints, we can understand that the Lord does have a very clear and significant plan. And here also, in that verse, we see that Bhishma Dev is speaking. Now I remember when I used to hear that Bhishma was a Mahajan, I couldn't quite understand how could this person be a Mahajan. Because externally speaking, he was fighting for the Kauravas, who were the enemies of Krishna and the Pandavas. And being a Mahajan, he should know the higher principles of Dharma. Like often he would say that he was bound by duty, right? Because of his loyalty to the kingdom, etc. He was fighting on behalf of the Kauravas. But then someone may say, but doesn't he know in the Gita Krishna says, Sarva Dharma Parityaja Mamikam Sharanam Raja, right? Based on that verse, some of us here have even abandoned our duties to our family. And so one may say, if he's a Mahajan, then surely he should follow that path. But it's described by the great Acharyas that Krishna had another plan. And in this regard, Prabhupada quotes one verse from the CC. Yanira chitta Krishna prem kariya udayoy tanra vakya kriya mudra vigneha na bujhaya. It's described that even the most learned person, he cannot understand the words, the activities and the symptoms of someone who's situated on love, on the platform of love of God. So in this regard, he quotes this verse in reference to Bhishma Dev. And it's described that Bhishma Dev played this role, he played the enemy of Krishna, to show the world that it doesn't matter how great you are. If you're not on the side of Krishna, you will not win. Because it's described actually, Bhishma Dev was the greatest warrior. So it doesn't matter how intelligent you are, how strong you are, how qualified you are. If you're not on the side of Krishna, you will not win. And Bhishma Dev, his greatness is that he was willing to be blasphemed, he was willing to be misunderstood, he was willing to experience a painful death to serve the Lord in that capacity. And Prabhupada also describes that Bhishma Dev had an interesting relationship with Krishna. He describes that Krishna, he's Akila Rasa Mita Sindhu. He can relate and have rasas with people in various ways. And specifically it's described that the Lord had a chivalry rasa or a ghastly rasa with Bhishma Dev. And it's described that when Bhishma, he shot arrows at Krishna, Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur, he compares them to love bites. So sometimes a lover in enthusiasm gives love bites to one's beloved. So similarly, those arrows were taken like that. And in another place, Prabhupada mentions, just as one offers flowers to the Lord, similarly those arrows were taken as flowers being offered to the Lord. So again, we see through this pastime in particular that things are not always as they seem. Just recently I acquired the biography of Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, and I was telling this pastime actually at Soho the other day. And in there there's one really interesting pastime, and the Bhaktivedanta Swami, he titles it A Murderous Attack. So it's described that during, I think, the 5th annual Navadvip Parikrama, there was a particular incident that was quite significant. It's described, Navadvip at that time, the caste Goswamis were the dominant force in Navadvip. And Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, he's known as Simha Guru, his lion guru, and he was fearless. And he would openly attack any deviations from proper Siddhanta. And it's described that at that time the caste Goswamis, they were doing so many atrocious things in the name of religion. They were charging people to enter temples and take darshan of the Lord. They were making basically a business of reciting the Bhagavatam and performing kirtan. They were often in the pretense of being a guru, a spiritual leader, making lots of money and cheating many people. And as a result, Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj would openly attack them. And that annoyed them. But even more than that, the caste Goswamis, because they were propagating at that time that Navadvip was the birthplace of Lord Chaitanya, when actually Mayapur was the birthplace of Lord Chaitanya. And so Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj was also preaching this. And as a result, business went down for the caste Goswamis. So they were becoming more and more irritated. And there were more and more small incidents and clashes. And this ultimately culminated in, at one point, one of Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj's senior sannyasis, Srimat Tirtha Swami, he was giving one class. And during that, there were several hundred pilgrims present hearing. And it's described that a group which appeared like dacoits came. And they began to, the deities were situated on an elephant. They were mounted on an elephant. And so they began to throw, it's described, brickbats. I'm not sure what that is. Anyway. And they began to throw brickbats at the elephant. And then a few others came. And then it turned into a full-on attack. And so the devotees, they were trying to run away. But many of them got caught in the attack. They were even trying to find shelter in the homes of a lot of the local villagers that were present. But it's described that the villagers were warned that do not give shelter to these Vaishnavas. Otherwise, in the future, some serious incidents will take place. And so it's described like this, that many of the pilgrims there were hurt. It's described that there was one young person that was unconscious because of the attack. But unfortunately, by the grace of Nrsingadev, it's described that no one got killed. Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj was also present, and one of his brahmachari disciples, is described Vinod Bihari Brahmachari. He quickly took Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj away and took him to one house. And at that time, the brahmacharis, they would wear white cloth, and the sannyasis would wear red cloth. So Vinod Bihari, he encouraged Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj to swap clothes. And then, once they had swapped clothes, this brahmachari, he escorted Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj out of Navadvip back to Mayapur. And so this was a little bit of a shock for the Gaudiya Math. And the next day, the local villagers heard about what had happened. And it's described that they actually were very disappointed and very ashamed of what the caste Goswamis had done. And as a result, it's described that any little credibility that they had, any little good reputation that the caste Goswamis had, disappeared. And it's described that the parikram didn't stop, that Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj was conducting. But now the police, the local police, accompanied and protected the parikram. And it's described that because of this incident, the Gaudiya Math received great publicity. It's described that the major newspapers in Bengal featured this incident. And it's described how in one major newspaper in Bengal, the front pages for like consecutively 4 or 5 days had an encampment or an enactment from a witness describing the whole incident. And it said how the incident that happened 400 years ago involving Jagai and Madai and Lord Nityananda has happened again today. And so Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj was asked, why don't you take these caste Goswamis and the dacoits that performed this act to court? I think you'll have a good case. But he declined. And he said, actually, these caste Goswamis and these dacoits, they have performed great service. Because how else is it that the Gaudiya Math have featured in the major newspapers of Bengal for 4 consecutive days? So Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj actually saw it as a blessing that this whole incident had took place. And he took it as the plan of the Lord. Also, we see in the life of Srila Prabhupada, from an external perspective, Prabhupada went through so many difficulties. As a grihastha, grihastha ashram means, good wife, good children, good money. And we see in all these aspects of his grihastha ashram, Prabhupada was experiencing difficulty, right? He had a wife that wouldn't cooperate with him. It's described when he would invite sadhus down around his home to hold a program. She would go to another floor in the house and she would drink tea and talk prajalpa. Even it's described how she sold his bhagavatam set for, I think, some cookies. And then ultimately Prabhupada said to her, it's either me or tea, and she chose tea, right? She thought Prabhupada was joking, but ultimately Prabhupada took vanapras. Also, Prabhupada, his son, I think Prayag Raj, Prabhupada had a lot of hopes for him. But it's described how he fell in love with one girl, and due to social reasons, they weren't allowed to marry, and as a result, he went mad. And it's described how he would sometimes loiter in the streets, picking up litter, placing it in one place, and taking it to another. It's also described financially, Prabhupada wasn't always in the best situation. It's described at one point he didn't have enough money to even buy a dhoti. It's described how when he was in Jhansi, he heard about how his business in Allahabad had been ransacked by his servants, and he'd lost everything, all the medicines and all the money that he had in his pharmaceutical business there. And normally speaking, someone who would go through all these experiences would probably end up in a mental asylum or be suffering from severe depression. But Prabhupada smiled and he quoted one verse from the Bhagavatam. He says, "Yasya ham anugrinami harisya taddanam shane tato dhyanam tyajanti yasya swajana dukha dukitam." He explains how the Lord, when He especially favors someone, He takes away all their wealth. And in this situation, his family and his friends, his relatives, they reject him. Many people in this world will put so much great value in these things, wealth and family. But Prabhupada just took it as the mercy of the Lord. He thought, finally, now I can dedicate myself in serving Shri Radha and Krishna. So we see through these pastimes and lessons from the lives of great saints and acharyas that sometimes when we go through difficulties or we see reverses in our lives, that they may be a blessing or a benediction. And we're not pure devotees, and we're not non-devotees. We're kind of in the middle. And in one sense, our consciousness is similar to the consciousness of demigods. And when we read the Bhagavatam, we see how often the Lord interacts with the demigods. We sometimes see how the demigods, they have this devotional inclination, but because of material desires and because they're surrounded by material facilities, they sometimes become bewildered by those facilities. And the Lord, showing His mercy, He comes and intervenes, and He may remove those things that are causing pride in that particular individual's life. And we see sometimes the Lord may come in this way in our own lives. If a certain thing that we acquire or a certain facility that we have is a disturbance to our devotional life, the Lord may come and cause difficulty, remove that thing, and as a result, we practice a higher level of devotional service. See, Krishna doesn't want Kama Mishra Bhaktis. He doesn't want mixed devotees. He wants us to become pure devotees. And so He may assist us in that way. Like Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj, he sometimes says, which I often quote, sometimes mercy comes from the front, but sometimes mercy also comes from the back. In a way that you don't expect it. And so Prabhupada mentions that when these difficulties come, we have to understand that this may be the mercy of the Lord. And we have to continue undisturbed in our devotional service. And Prabhupada says that if we have this mood, then we are guaranteed to go back to Godhead. Prabhupada also mentions, I think in the Gita, that the greatness of a person is known by his ability to tolerate difficult situations. And often we see sometimes when we're comfortable in our spiritual lives, Krishna's there, and many other things are there. But when we go through difficulties and crises, it's not that Krishna's just part of our life. But Krishna is our life. And Krishna is our life. And so in that situation, we may or may not understand it. But we have to have faith that whatever's happening is for our good, is for our benefit. Prabhupada gives the example also of sometimes when a child is young, or the son is young, the father may chastise the son. And the son at that time may not understand, why is the father chastising me? Why is he putting me through this experience? But when he gets older, when he reflects, he understands. And so sometimes it's like that. Krishna may put us through some difficult situation, or the situation may appear to be a reverse in our own calculation. But later on, we understand why the Lord is putting us through that. So on that point, I'll end. I've gone over time by 5 minutes. Thank you for listening so patiently. Do we have time for questions? Or